Hi. Thanks for coming bright and early Saturday morning. This is How to Change a Narrative, a guide for activists and peace builders. My name is Truitt. I'm the Media Relations Director in the Communications Department here in Philadelphia at the American Friends Service Committee, which means that I deal with the media and our relationship to them. And I will let Beth introduce herself.
And my name is Beth Hallowell. I'm the Communications Research Director here at AFSC, which means I do a couple of different kinds of research to help us get our messages right as best we can.
So both of us are here working in part on narrative change work in the media and in our messaging. So that's why we're doing this session today. So to start out, if you can go to the first slide, please. We were wondering, what is narrative change? Does anyone have an idea? This buzzword's been floating around recently. Does anyone have an idea what it actually means or what we're talking about today? Yeah.
I'm just making a guess, and I think it's if there is some stuff that you disagree with, how can you find a way to turn that to a way in which you can agree so that it reaches other people as well?
Great, great. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm not sure what it means, but what I hope it means is helping us, find a way to talk to the other side.
Find a way to
hear
what?
our points.
Talk to the other
Find a way to talk to the other side so they can hear your points. Great. What else? Yeah.
I think it's a way to elevate your own values and your own story about how you view the world.
Values.
And to sort of try to connect with people in that value funnel.
Values and stories. That's great. Anything else? Yeah.
I guess I'm piggybacking on what she said, but basically making a coherent, compelling story such that the opposing side wants to engage because they have to, it challenges their story to such
Right.
a significant degree that they have any sense of wanting to get to a mutual understanding, then there has to be further steps there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all a really great definition of narrative change. Yeah.
Kind of borrowing a little bit from public health education, there the idea is you want to give people information that will help them to change their behavior.
Right.
And so in this case, the narrative change, you still want it to be value-based. You want to make sure that you're still being accurate about it, but you want to give people that bridge to get the change.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, it might also fundamentally, as a beginning process, to ask ourselves, why does the narrative need to change?
That's a good question. What we understand narrative change to be is, yeah, first of all, it's about narratives, and narratives are stories. As people have said, there's public narratives that are out there in different fields, in politics, in government, in the media, in health, in insurance. There's narratives everywhere, stories that frame situations that we use to understand our world. We're not just understanding things through facts and figures. We understand things through stories, through a human level. A narrative change strategy, which is what we're focused on today, aims at creating a groundswell of stories that shift people's focus and the ways our issues are framed. It helps us build widespread support because right now there's stories out there, there's dominant narratives out there that are setting us up to lose on immigration, on health care, on war and violence and militarism, on everything we work on. There's dominant narratives out there. A story that's saying that immigrants are violent, that Muslims are inherently violent, that we need to protect ourselves by closing our borders. If we can change these stories, we can create a context in which our work can actually win. We like to think that just the truth, just the facts, is going to get us to victory, but I think in this past election we've maybe seen that that doesn't work so great. Obviously facts still matter, reality still matters, but how do you get people there? How do you get them to care to begin with? It's through stories, it's through an emotional level, it's through values, just like folks were saying. So I'm here at AFSC doing media work. Beth's here doing research work around. We're focused really on that field of where narratives happen, and that's where a lot of the focus of our conversation is going to be. But as Dottie brought up, this is something that's happening in a lot of fields. It's something that lobbyists are using when they're framing issues with politicians, that lobbyists are using narrative change when they're framing issues for politicians, healthcare providers, to raise the awareness of patients, to lobby for changes. And this is something that the opposition has been doing forever, that conservatives have been funding. They've known that the stories that we tell, that's why Fox News exists, to tell everyone a story that's setting us up to lose. It's a really new thing right now that the left is really jumping into this stories level and realizing that we have to reach people emotionally, not just factually. Yeah.
Because you had mentioned people care about values and integrity and the truth. The reality is, we'll say anything. Of any accountability, we just win the election. And now we're proceeding down this path of enriching ourselves with nothing. We'll say whatever.
Right. So when we talk about values, what we mean is what is the core thing underlying our beliefs? What is that important thing for us? And like you're saying,
that's what I'm seeing on the other side.
Right, we thought it was truth. Doesn't seem to be. Seems like there's, you know, a lot of panic around safety. There's racism is a clear value that undergirds a lot of things. What are the values that we can speak to that get people to care about things? What are the values that are going to activate our base? What are the values that are going to convince people and get them impassioned enough to move with us? I want to talk about a couple of examples of working with a narrative change strategy that come from my experience before AFSC, because we're really in the middle of a number of narrative change campaigns right now. So I came here from a media background as a freelance writer and journalist, and also I ran a publication for 8 years called Feministing, which has an audience of predominantly young feminists. And when I started there almost a decade ago, our audience was almost exclusively young, white, college-educated feminists. I was sort of part of a second round of leadership of this site, and we had a real goal of getting this audience that we knew we had access to care about the social justice issues we were engaged in that we weren't seeing talked about within feminism. We were seeing feminism framed as a personal empowerment movement. We were seeing it framed in the like lean in corporate capitalist context, and we knew that issues like immigration and trans rights and police violence, that war, militarism, all have a gender element to them, and we wanted to see our base caring about these things and moving to these things. What we didn't have is a lot of money and resources. So when we were working on issues that we saw people pushing back on, pushing against us, we really sort of were struck with what can we do? What can we do to change the situation? One of the first ones of those that I experienced was around immigration. Whenever we wrote about immigration on our own publication, our comment section was full of white women saying, well, the immigrants are coming here to steal our jobs and rape us and all these really offensive, horrible narratives that we hear in the mainstream all the time. We knew that our audience cared about feminism, they considered themselves to be feminist, but also that the version of feminism that most of them were operating from, that they'd learned in school, was a white feminism that centered whiteness, and that didn't have space for immigrants, refugees, people of color and their experiences, because they didn't understand it as a feminist issue. So we tried a lot of things. We wrote about immigration in a lot of ways. We looked at our stats, we looked at our analytics, because we didn't have the money and resources to do research, but we were plugged into the communities that were doing the work. We were talking with dreamers and activists, people who were shutting down detention centers and hearing what was important to them, lifting those things up. And eventually what we discovered was that when we talked about the issue through a gender lens, when we talked about women in detention, children in detention, trans women in detention and what they were experiencing, our audience stayed on that emotional level. They reacted with us, they were on board with us, and that moved them to view the issue differently. This picture is Isa Noyola, who's an activist with the Transgender Law Center, getting arrested, shutting down an immigration detention center. This is the kind of story that we started telling. We recruited writers who were doing this, who were getting arrested in the streets, protesting, who were in the movements, in the communities, and gave them access to a more mainstream, more privileged audience who we wanted to move to be supporting. This was part of a lot of consciousness raising around immigration, a lot of organizing. This was one place in it, but we saw a shift within feminism. We saw a shift within our audience of young white feminists who were increasingly influential in the movement to viewing immigration as a feminist issue, to viewing it as something and central and something that we should be working on and moving on. So we knew where we were starting with values that we shared, but that there was a problem we were facing in terms of our understanding of those values. We've experimented and tried a lot of things, found a lens that spoke to people and saw actual movement. Another example of something that I worked on throughout my time in media was trans rights, transgender rights and justice issues, particularly around anti-trans violence against trans women of color who face an epidemic of murders in the US and abroad every year that's escalating, getting worse, not better. It's primarily targeted at women of color and sex workers, and criminalization and systems of discrimination make things a lot worse. This was something that I thought my base that I was speaking to, that I thought feminists should care about for obvious reasons. It's gender-based violence. It was also something that I thought my colleagues should care about. I was going to meetings in groups with LGBT journalists, feminist journalists, people running media sites, doing online organizing. And I was seeing that even the LGBT publications, when they were writing about anti-trans violence, they were misgendering women who got killed, calling them men, using their former names. They were reporting exactly what the police told them rather than the real story. So even the media that should have been supportive, that should have been doing consciousness raising around this, wasn't. I was plugged into a different community. I was listening to the people who were impacted by this, and I had access to other people with platforms. So in addition to using my own media platform, I would go to conferences with my colleagues and stand up and say, you're part of the problem. We have this serious issue going on. It's something that we should all be working on. I know you actually care about it because we're talking about it and sitting down here, but look what's happening in the pages of your own publications. What can you do? And myself and other people started to see a shift in that. I was one of many people doing this. I was lifting up other people's voices. Yeah.
How did they respond to that question?
I mean, there's one very distinctive meeting that which is a big progressive conference, in a room with a bunch of LGBT media. I stood up, I said that I knew I was shaming all of my colleagues publicly. I thought I was going to get a huge backlash. I couldn't get out of the room because people kept coming up to me thanking me because they needed to hear that and they needed to bring it back with them, and I knew they cared, and I wasn't coming from a place of you're the bad guy, but I was coming from a place of you're part of the problem that you want to fix. What can we do about that together? And there was pushback and there was issues. Feminism has a long history of bigotry against trans women, trans people, and that's pushback that I experienced throughout my career within feminism. But we have seen real shifts in media coverage. The year after that conference, I went to that same group and I said, okay, you're doing a lot better coverage. What I haven't seen in your pages are stories of trans women of color who are alive. I'm only hearing about them when they die. I'm not hearing their voices in your pages. Some of the publications I talked to started publishing profiles. I pointed them to people, said, hire this writer, listen to this person. There's still a lot of problems there. This is not an issue that's been fixed, but we have had this big moment in media. Folks like Laverne Cox, there was this trans tipping point article in Time magazine that was sort of a big media moment. This hasn't led to rights and justice. This has led to a political backlash in some ways. But there is now a base of people who care and are much more active in a way that we haven't seen before. They're on publications, LGBT publications, progressive publications, now mainstream publications like the Huffington Post, are covering this issue, writing about it consistently. We've got a lot of room to grow, but we did create a lot of shifts over the course of the last couple decades. And I got to play a small part of that because of these people I had access to, because I knew who my audience was, what mattered to them, and figured out how I could get them to move, and then get them to move other people, because I couldn't speak to everyone. There were pieces that I was writing 3-4 years ago on my own publication because no one would pay me for them, and now I see them getting quoted in the New York Times with someone making exactly the same argument, because that's how you do it. That's how you push a narrative into the mainstream. So to talk a little bit just about this process of changing a narrative that I've just gone through a couple examples of. The first thing, like any organizing project, because this is about organizing, it's not necessarily always when you're doing sort of the conceptual work of narrative change, that experience of face-to-face conversation, but that's where we're leading, that's where this is going. This is about moving people and moving them to action. So like with all organizing, you need a clear goal, you need to know what you're trying to accomplish, and you need to know why narrative change is necessary to win. Why do you have to change the story? What's the story that's being told that's setting you up to lose on immigration? What are people hearing that's making them think that their safety is dependent on throwing people in detention? What story do they need to hear that's going to help them win? This is a place where resources like research are incredible, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So once you've got a clear goal identified, like I said, research. I didn't have access to that in my previous job, so what I had was some data on what we were already doing. So we threw a lot of things at the wall and saw what stuck. And testing is part of the research process, but one of the perks for me of this job is actually having a research department in-house, which is really weird and should be normal. So that's really exciting. And then knowing who your audience is. Like, I'm not going to speak to everyone. Not everyone is going to listen to me all the time. If I can access a strategic group of people, like other people working in media, for example, and shift the stories in their minds and shift how they tell stories, they can do that with their whole audience. And then we can shift how they tell stories in their communities, in their world. If we could move those people and they can move more people, we can create a groundswell. We can create something that spreads. We can create new stories for our movements to build from. So once we've got all that, once we understand all that, there we go. We need to be flexible and try a bunch of things. This is a guy reading a newspaper. And this is basically what the process of actually doing this work is like. There's a lot of advanced work, a lot of research and trying things. But when you're actually out there using stories in your work, you need to be flexible. You need to be prepared for something not to work. You need to be prepared for a story to work and be so successful that you start hearing the other side saying the same thing to convince people of their position and their argument. Constantly reevaluating, constantly re-strategizing, saying, is this working? What's working best? Where do I need to shift? It's important to have that advanced work so that you're not just reacting to someone else's story. When you've got the stories that you want to tell, when you know the values you're speaking to, when you have a clear understanding of the problem that you're framing, what the solution is to it, how you want to motivate people to action, then you can be responsive to the news. You can be responsive to shifts in the landscape. And this kind of strategy we're seeing being utilized more and more, and we're seeing it have a lot of impact right now as we're building this huge movement in a really, really terrifying moment in this country. That rubric of values, problem, solution, action is something we're going to keep talking about. It's something we learned from the Opportunity Agenda, which is an organization that works on a lot of these things. And I'm going to turn it over to Beth, who's going to talk about our research work and some of what we're working on now here at AFSC. And we will do Q&A.
Yes, yes. Excuse me. Hold on for just a sec. There we go. Okay. Great. Thanks, Joss. So again, my name is Beth Hallowell, and along with Joss and our amazing communications teams and our amazing organizing teams working all over the world, we're aiming to change a couple of different narratives in particular through 3 projects that I'm going to talk about, as well as one project from the past that was very successful. Before we get started, though, I wanted to ask if anybody was already active on the issue of Islamophobia in particular. Yeah? A couple folks? For the folks who are already active on this issue, what motivates you to take action, to get involved? Yeah?
Beloved community and First Amendment.
Okay, great. Yeah?
The unfairness of it.
Okay. It's not fair? Absolutely.
I don't know, I mean, we have a school in our area called the Islamic Study Academy.
Okay.
I'm part of the high school piece over, so normally it's the Fairfax County, Virginia public schools. We reached out to the private study academy, so they're the recipient that gets an award as well.
So it's something going on in your community, it's something that's maybe right, your neighbors, affects your family.
Yeah, so that's how I look at it.
Yeah, so I heard an issue of fairness, yeah.
The other one is that if you don't do anything, it's a slippery slope, and it goes further and further and further, and the next thing you know, you're almost helpless about doing anything. So stopping it early is helpful.
So there's issues of faith that you brought up, as well as civil liberties, and I'm hearing issues of civil liberties, human rights in your answer as well. Yeah.
Specifically religious freedom.
Religious freedom, right, yeah.
I read the mixed messages pamphlet from AFSC.
Oh, great.
I was just kind of shocked, and it just kind of like opened up my mind. I was like,
wonderful.
Yeah, there's so many of these narratives about how violent that Muslims are, and they're just not right.
Yeah.
And I heard so much of that coming out of Trump's mouth and the lies around that with the immigration bans earlier this year. It just made me furious.
That's, yeah.
And start to see people get affected by it around us.
Absolutely. Yeah, Alice.
one of the things in my work which gives me pause, and I don't think I have answers to it exactly, but I do know that there is no behavior without a cause.
Mm-hmm.
Something's causing it.
Mm-hmm.
Question is, what is it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know in part it's fear,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we need to discuss more how to deal with those fears.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the things that I meet, for instance, I meet other Christians in other churches in the neighborhood, and they seem to have forgotten totally what Jesus might have said.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have a whole different narrative on that subject than I would have, or many of you might have.
Uh-huh.
And so I think if we can think together about how to figure out, because as I say, there is no behavior without a cause.
Mm-hmm.
Something's making it happen.
And when you say something's making it happen, are you thinking about people who are spouting sort of Islamophobic rhetoric, or taking or acting in a way that would discriminate against Muslims and other religious minorities?
I'm beginning to read that there are some people who begin to understand that it's fear that is causing. But then, you know, people have these attitudes who never met a Muslim and not one time in their whole lives. So why?
It's got to be something else, right?
Why is this narrative going on that we would like to change?
That's a really important point. None of these are fixed in stone, right? They all came from somewhere, and they can all go somewhere different. Yeah. Did you have something to add, or Zahar? Yeah.
I was just going to add also like the responsibility of public privilege.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So if you're not active on this issue, what would inspire you or motivate you to take action? This is like a thought experiment.
An egregious account in the newspaper about an attack?
Yeah. Something that brings up some empathy, or just like is really shocking and damning. Yeah.
Something in my community.
Yeah. Something at home, something that hits close to friends and neighbors and your own kids and your own families. Absolutely. That's great. Thank you. So you guys are actually, oh, go ahead. Yeah, one more.
Yeah, I'm part of the Sikh community too.
Oh, okay.
One of the leaders of our Sikh network in Los Angeles was pictured in USA Today as under an article that said Muslim terrorists banned, and we were just all shocked.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, hits close to, again, it's your community. Yeah.
Completely confused about the two different religions.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. So these responses are actually not that far off from what we've been finding in our research on how to build support to end the profiling and surveillance of Muslims through exactly the kind of process that Joss has just been describing. We just completed a research study that polled we surveyed people across the US to help us develop messages for this campaign. And we found that the top two values that people were responding to were respect for human rights and safety and peace in my own community. So what does that mean? That means when we asked people, like what kinds of messages, what kinds of language, what kinds of feelings and values do you have when you think about Islamophobia as an issue in general and the profiling and surveillance of Muslims in particular, what people came back to us with was, well, it's important because we need to respect everyone's human rights, and it's important because everyone deserves to live safely, in peace, in their own homes. They deserve to pray in peace. That was something that actually came up a lot. Religious freedom is important, and so forth. So the answers in this room are actually pretty close to where our national survey landed when we asked people in a positive framework to tell us what moves you when you think about these things, even if you haven't experienced it yourself. And we did talk to people who had never met, who were of one faith and had never met someone who was Muslim themselves. We talked to people all over the country. We talked to people of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds, gender backgrounds, professional backgrounds, educational levels, and so forth. And these were the We worked with a research firm to do a national online search. Well, we did two phases. I'll talk a little bit about the methods because I'm a wonk. No, we did a series of in-depth telephone surveys with our research partners, recruited through their online recruiting database. And then we fielded an online survey that was a much larger sample size. And again, recruited through their online database. Yeah. And we intentionally recruited folks who met a variety of different background criteria, or at least self-identified as meeting those criteria, because we wanted to get a diversity of voices. And we wanted to talk to people who we thought would be movable on this issue. So we did exclude the alt-right, people who came back to us as my political views are very conservative or very, very, very alt-right. But we did include a fair number of moderates and a fair number of sort of a little bit left of alt-right conservatives. We did include people who are members of the Republican Party, for example. I don't quite know how to phrase that yet. A variety of different political backgrounds, excluding the very, very far fringe right.
And why did you exclude them?
Well, because we were interested in people we thought we could move on this issue and people that we have access to, just as Joss was saying. So it was a strategic decision based on the audiences we thought we could reach with the platforms that we have. We know we have great access to progressives in particular, so we talked to a lot more progressives than we talked to anybody else. And by access to progressives, I mean the relationships that Joss and our colleagues in communications have built with progressive online media, our Facebook audience, and our organizers on the ground working with a variety of different communities are often working alongside other progressive organizations. But that doesn't mean we want to leave out the rest of the US. It just means we have limited time and resources, and we wanted to be strategic about the audiences that we were trying to reach, at least at this initial stage. We don't see this as like a short-term, one-year thing that's going to be fixed Islamophobia by May 2017 or something like that.
So your goal here really is about mobilizing friendly people versus convincing people that are not as friendly.
Exactly.
Although I will say, I think the safety value is a value that Islamophobia, like that's a connecting value.
So that's a really interesting, I'm glad you brought that up. And let me just show you some of the language that we did test, just so you can get a flavor of what this looks like a little more in practice. Before I move on to your point, I'm glad you brought that up. So when we were testing those values, we were also testing different kinds of language to see what people were responding to. And this was the message, this was the actual language that resonated most with most people when we were talking about, like, what can we do to motivate you on this issue if you aren't already? Or if you are already, what can we say to keep you inspired? And then on the next slide, this was our safety and peace language. And it touches a little bit on religious freedom as well. All of us deserve to feel safe from hatred and to live and pray in peace. So the problem, as we're identifying it in our campaign, and by the way, there's a parallel workshop going on right now the Communities Against Islamophobia group is running. That's the on the ground, that's the ground game organizing component to what I'm talking about. This is the communication side of things. And I invite you, they're going to repeat their workshop in the next slot, so I strongly encourage you to stop by their workshop. They're doing some amazing organizing work in 3 cities across the US, so definitely check that out. But one of the problems that we've identified as part of this campaign that we want to build, to start with progressive and more moderate support for, is the problem of ending profiling and surveillance of Muslims. And what the research has helped us see is that respecting human rights value and that safety and peace value, if we can frame this problem in those terms, that's what's going to keep the fire in the belly going for the base of people who are already working on this issue, as well as bring new people along. Same with the solution that we've identified. So ending profiling and surveillance of Muslims was always one of the goals that people in AFSC wanted to work on because they're working with affected communities and because they've been doing this organizing work on the ground for a really long time. The question wasn't what should the solution be or what the problem was necessarily. It was more about how to frame it in a way that would speak to a maximum number of people. And again, keep that base going and ignite more progressives on this issue, as well as bring new audiences along. So now we're learning that we're framing the problem and the solution in those values terms. And this also helps us frame our actions. Again, ending Islamophobic policies was always going to be part of the puzzle. It was just a matter of how do we talk about it to bring along the maximum number of people and for maximum impact. So before I move on, I wanted to address your question, because one of the things that we learned, or your important point, one of the things we learned through research is that actually those two different frames speak a little bit differently to different audiences. That our base, our progressive, again, mostly online, but also on the ground audience was really excited and really sort of fired up about the human rights language. And our research and other people's research has shown, Joss mentioned the Opportunity Agenda. They're a wonderful organization. I invite you to check them out online. They've done a lot of messaging research, and we use their stuff all the time. It's really top-notch. We've found, and they've also found, that human rights language doesn't work so great for other people. It's excellent if you're talking to other progressives, and especially if you're a progressive organization talking to another progressive organization, or you're an organized group of progressives talking to other people who identify as liberal or progressive and so forth. And it starts to get a little stale for other audiences, or at least, better said, it's not the best foot forward that you can put in terms of framing. That safety and peace value that I mentioned, however, did much better with a more moderate, or politically moderate, I should say, people self-identifying as more middle of the road. I lean left, but I don't consider myself very left, that kind of political identity. That framing worked a lot better with them. Yeah?
Would the narrative change if you changed the phrase human rights?
Mm-hmm.
And what was the result?
Oh, say that again. So if you...
Would the narrative change?
Yeah.
In terms of the people who you were trying to reach who said that we don't really respond to human rights, what kind of phrase would you put in there besides human rights that would move people?
So I would change, so for that audience, and this is the kind of thing we're going to test out over the next few months to see if it actually works. But what our research says is don't start with human rights. Start with that safety and peace message. Start with we all have the right, we all deserve to live and pray in peace. We all deserve safe communities. We all deserve peaceful communities. Language like that. And if you want to include human rights in that, that's great, but it's about putting that best foot forward. In our super mediatized, digitized world, people with short attention spans, you want to really, and who are getting tons of messages all the time. It's about getting as many people and maximizing that impact as best you can when you may only have a few seconds or a few minutes to catch someone's attention or really get them in their hearts, as Joss was saying, because it's about getting people at their level of their values.
So for example, I was going to say, I think another answer to your question might be when you do the messaging, you don't use the human rights word because people don't resonate. But actually, that other one about being able to pray in peace, that's a human rights message.
Yeah, that's a good point. Say the word human rights. That's a really good point. Yeah.
I think when you get to the level of messaging, you have to be real. A lot of this is framing, right?
Right.
But when you get to the level of messaging, the words you use really make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also something that we will be testing. This research literally hit my desk about a week and a half ago. So we haven't had the opportunity yet to start folding it into our communications on this issue, but that's top of our agenda for the next couple of months is to use these findings to help us and our colleagues working on the ground to shape our messages, both when we're talking to progressive media, as Joss does every day, and our Facebook audience, as our colleague Irit does every single day, but also our folks on the ground.
People are more moved by concrete examples of stuff than they are by abstract concepts, like human rights is kind of
absolutely. Absolutely, and that's another good point. And a reason, I don't know this through research, but I suspect a reason that the human rights language works so well for progressives is because they have those working examples in their heads already, and other people may not. But when you talk about safety in your community, it's a real quick step for most people to get to, those wonderful people, or my Sikh community who's not Muslim but is getting swept up in this Islamophobic bucket. Or the folks that my kids go to school with who are under threat right now. I think that's a much shorter jump for a lot of people, and it's certainly a lot easier in the communications end to bring up concrete examples that will resonate with people. Your immigration example is a really good example of that too.
We do mostly speak to a progressive audience, but there's an example we placed an op-ed by one of the lawyers we work with in the Midwest. Jody's op-ed was about children she works with and mothers she works with, and the fear that they were experiencing and the turmoil they were experiencing, and what they were going to give up, how they were seeing their families torn apart, the confusion. We put that in conservative papers in red states because that's the way of talking about this. It's still a human rights issue.
And it got really good pickup.
yeah, they love that piece.
Yeah. Yes.
I've seen that sometimes using the word safety
Mm.
from more conservative people, they think, oh yeah, we need more police and we'll be safe.
Yes.
So that's kind of a trap I fall into.
Absolutely, and that's something that we'll be watching on our end as we test messages. That's something we'll be watching out for. And one of the great things about my job and the team that we work with is that we have the capacity to use things like analytics as well as additional studies to keep our eyes on that and see, like, okay, who's really picking up on this and how? Is it working the way we thought it was going to work? Great. Is it not? Okay, let's revise and figure something else out. So we have ongoing data collection and ongoing, meetings and collaborations and so forth to make this an iterative process, a process that we're constantly refining. Absolutely. Yeah.
You guys have research partners to help you pick the target audience, but are there any suggestions you have? I mean, I frequently hear people saying, well, you have to go to the conservatives and try and talk to them and work with them instead of turning them into the enemy, which is part of the narrative problem, I think, to start with. But I'm often left wondering, well, where do we start? How do we find those people? If we don't have a research partner to help kind of strategize who our target audience might be.
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for that?
That's a really great question. I don't have a blanket suggestion except to say that depending on the goals, your personal, maybe they're your personal goals, the goals of your meeting, the goals of whatever organization or network you're working with. I would say depending on the goal, that's how you choose the audience. And we do a lot of brainstorming and strategizing and communications to help just ourselves as well as our colleagues on the ground pick an audience, a couple of concrete audiences that we, as Joss mentioned before, have access to and think we can move. Do I try to have those conversations with conservative people I know? Sure, that's great. And I wouldn't discourage anybody from ever doing that. When I have my research director hat on or my communications hat on, is that the place where I think we should start sometimes? Maybe, but it depends on the goal of the campaign, and it depends on what we're trying to achieve and when we have the resources and the time and the bandwidth and the access to achieve. And for us, that typically does mean at least starting on the progressive end, because a lot of these things don't have a broad base of support, or they do, but it's not well organized. And so that's a lot of where our work here at AFSC is at right now. It's not just like it's not that we don't want to change the alt-right. Of course we do. Nobody would say no to that, right? Or even like sort of a more, again, I hate to say it like this, but like left of alt-right, a little more conservative, but maybe more friendly conservative. I don't know how to phrase that. I'll have to think of something. But a more conservative audience than we typically talk to. It's not that nobody wants to change their minds. Of course we all want to change their minds. But it's about building up, but we also have the constraints of, limited time, limited resources, who do we have access to, and who do we think we can move now, and who do we think we can move tomorrow? Because again, this is not a short-term process. Just because we pick one audience now doesn't mean we don't pick another audience stepwise as we move forward with our messaging and our campaign organizing. Yeah.
Are you working with Muslim groups?
Absolutely, yeah. And Mary Zirkle, Dina Al-Rafi, that's what their workshop on the Communities Against Islamophobia is about. They do a lot of incredible work on the ground in Chicago, Cambridge, and Indianapolis, Joss, anywhere?
And now North Carolina.
And North Carolina too, great. Thanks for reminding me of that. Yeah, sorry?
There's a Muslim education program not too far from the headquarters.
Oh, great, yeah.
Where they are anxious to work with Quakers.
Great, oh, that's wonderful, that's wonderful. connecting them with community, I don't know if you have the connection there, but connecting them with communities against Islamophobia might be a great step. I know they do amazing work in the locations where they are, and they're using these resources as well. This is all about helping to inform not just our national communications on this issue, but also what's going to help them do their best job on the ground.
Yeah, and I would really encourage their training also for some of these concrete questions about actually doing these work in our communities, in our families,
Yep.
hostile audiences, because part of what they've been hearing from their Muslim partners is that progressives don't have the knowledge and information and skills to represent them well, and they need us to be going into our families and communities and addressing the problems there. So that's a lot of what that training is really designed to focus on and give people the skills for.
I don't understand. What are they saying? It's not important to reach out to Muslims themselves?
Oh, no.
What are they saying?
They're saying that non-Muslim progressives don't know about Muslim issues. They're not informed. They're not aware. They don't have the skills and knowledge to share with their own communities, and that they need a base of active allies who can do that work, who can speak to people, who can open their churches for sanctuary, who can do all of that. So specifically saying, come to us, listen to us, listen to our guidance, and share that with the communities we work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another, just to piggyback off of what Joss was saying, that's another way we pick our strategic audiences. It's not just me, Joss, and our colleagues sitting in a room. It's us sitting on the phone with our colleagues and their colleagues on the ground, asking who do you need to move that we may have access to and you may not. And progressive allies, white allies non-Muslim allies was a key audience there. So again, that helped us inform our research strategy, who we were talking to in the first place, to come up with these frames that were gonna work for somebody. We wanted to know specifically for those progressive audiences. Again, not just because we have access to that, but because others on the ground were telling us, we need to access those people and we don't have that access right now, but you do. So that was an important way for us to plug in. Yeah.
I don't know if this question answer, I can wait till the
Sure.
end, so. I can ask.
Oh, you can ask now, sure.
So how do you measure yourself? Like where do you want to get to and how far are you along on that path?
That's a great question. This campaign is still information, but that's a great bridge to talking about some of our other examples where we're a little further down the line in narrative change. So with the Gaza Unlocked example, we also went through the same process of using research to identify values, shared values. Human rights again came up, so did human dignity. When we talked again to mostly progressive US progressive audiences about their feelings and thoughts and what they know already about Palestine and Israel. And while we were not surprised to find out that human rights spoke to them, again, because of all this other research that we do and that others do that say that's pretty common, one of the things we did find that was even our progressive audience, our US-based progressive audience, the problem they identified for us was that they didn't know anything about the issue. They had sort of generically heard that it was a problem because anybody who's turned on the news has heard that the Middle East, Israel-Palestine, is a problem. But people were embarrassed that they didn't know what was going on. They felt like they should know, but they didn't also want to find out because it seemed so complicated. And they told us when we did interviews on the ground, they felt ashamed that they didn't know more about this important issue and that they didn't care to learn more because they felt so ashamed and embarrassed and sad and were having what we might call, in the literature they call crisis fatigue.
I think some of that is powerlessness.
I think so. I think it came from a place of powerlessness, absolutely. And this was a more progressive audience. So this is like people on the ground that were a little more progressive saying these things. So
there's also a really dominant narrative in that field that feels impossible to overcome.
Yep.
Sort of like the
hopelessness was something that came up.
The gun rights stuff too.
Absolutely, yeah. Hopelessness came up a lot in our interviews and in our research. Absolutely. So this helped us shape the Gaza Unlocked campaign, which launched about a month ago, or maybe 2 months ago now. not just in terms of human rights and human dignity as the shared value, but we identified the problem as people not knowing and not feeling embarrassed and feeling ashamed about that lack of knowledge and about that powerlessness as part of the problem that we needed to solve on the communications end. So that helped us shape the problem, and then the solution then became, well, okay, so how do we get people over that hump of shame and embarrassment and also not knowing anything and powerlessness? We need to start with human stories, with these really small day-to-day things like not having enough electricity, not having access to medical care, and use those personal stories as a lens to shed light on the blockade of Gaza, the Israeli occupation, and so forth, rather than starting with like lots and lots of numbers about how terrible everything is, or graphic photos and so forth. So we developed a campaign, or the part of the campaign that was developed as a result, the Gaza Unlocked campaign, really starts with those, with some very beautifully narrated and beautifully written individual stories that you can find at GazaUnlocked.org or through AFSC.org. And I'm sure my colleague Zahar has lots of important things and wonderful thoughts and insights on the campaign as well. The solution that we proposed was, okay, you feel embarrassed, you feel ashamed, you don't know anything. We totally don't want you to feel that way. Here's our friend so-and-so who lives in Gaza. Hear about his day-to-day life. Here is an AFSC staff member who's working, and he's got, this is what it's like for him to go to work every day, just like you go to work every day. Here's what it's like for his kids to go to school every day, and really use that personal hook to draw people in to the campaign.
So, I want to make sure I fully, frame it in sort of a legal argument kind of thing, or you can frame it in sort of an emotional appeal kind of way. I think that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Right? Yeah, we know from our research that the emotions are going to reach more people more often and better, basically. It's going to bring more people along. So that's why we start with those kinds of frames. Yeah.
Well, but even if you start with those personal things, the question is, how did they get there in the first place? And so an overview might be very, very valuable here if you characterize it as this is a situation that follows a war.
Oh, sure.
And then talk about how the ceasefire created these boundaries, and that's the problem. How can we?
Absolutely, and those resources are, and that information is available, and that sort of perspective is baked into the campaign 100%. What I'm talking about is the starting point. How do you get people who aren't experts, who've never been to Israel or Palestine, who may not ever get to go to the Middle East?
And you use plain language.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you frame these things, you frame these stories in these very human, day-to-day terms.
This is what happens when war occurs.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's the difference between starting with a bunch of facts and figures, which are very important. I'm not saying they're not, and they're on the website and they're part of the campaign as well. But our research shows that if you haven't gotten people here, you aren't going to necessarily get them with facts. And I can back that up with citations if anybody's curious, but if you like the podcast Hidden Brain on NPR, they actually just did a way better job than I ever could summarizing that psychological finding. It's Shankar Vedantham's Hidden Brain podcast from about a month ago. You can also read about it on our blog at Media Uncovered, where I wrote about it when it came out. But basically, if people feel ashamed and people feel mad or sad or really just have negative feelings about an issue, and you give them facts that challenge those feelings, they're going to double down on the feelings. They're not going to hear the facts. The feelings get stronger, and the facts go like this or like this. And so you have to change the feeling. You have to appeal to them at that values level so that they can hear that important information that you have to share. And our strategy... Exactly. Exactly. That's a great way to summarize it. You got to start with that heart-to-heart connection, or make a heart-to-heart connection if it's someone who's got negative feelings about X, Y, or Z issue. Otherwise, they're not going to hear the important information that you have to share, the facts that you have to share. Absolutely.
The other image I like is the open hand versus the fist. Our facts are like a fist.
Yeah.
If you only knew this, if
Yeah.
you only knew this, versus the open hand, the inviting people into a conversation.
Yeah, and we've all I've done that for sure, especially with family members who disagree. I'm just like, but you're so wrong, and I'm so right. And how can you not see that? But you're absolute. That's another great metaphor to embody that principle of, yeah, exactly. You have to invite someone into your conversation or invite someone into a conversation they're not accustomed to having before you can share new information with them, or especially if it's going to challenge the preconceived notions they've got in their head, rather than just like beat them over the head with a stick. Absolutely. And to your question, sorry, I got a little sidetracked, but to answer your earlier question about measurement and how do we know if we're making progress and so forth, we actually do have a couple of tools to help us. And again, a lot of that lives in the research and communications departments, or research team of the communications department. We look at things like online analytics, how many people are coming to our site, real bread and butter, like how many times are they, how long are they staying, what are they visiting when they go there, what are they sharing on other websites, whether that's sharing back to Facebook or Twitter, what are they talking about online, so when they do engage with us on our Facebook page or through some other form of digital media, what are they saying, how often, is it positive, is it negative? These are all things we can get a pretty clear grasp on, which is great. And one of the nice things about my job is that we can show some pretty clear outcomes and progress. On our end,
electronic communication type stuff, not.
So just to.
Not sort of.
So it's both, and when you go to Mary's workshop next, you're going to get to hear, if you went to, I guess she's not talking about Gaza Unlocked, but if you were to talk to Mike and Jennifer and our colleagues in Jerusalem and Gaza and so forth, they have goals as well, and they have indicators to show progress as well. I sit here in Philly. I sit mostly at the computer 3 floors up from here, 2 floors up from here. So the measurement and outcomes that we show do typically tend to be from online digital media, online organizing, online digital communications, and so forth.
I'm just curious, is it statistically significant? I mean, in other words, is the sample size enough so that you're confident with a high confident percentage that you are actually making a difference?
That's a great question. So we don't really have a way to get that fine-tuned yet. But someday we will have the chops to do stuff like that. Right now, mostly what we're looking at are things like analytics. So we're looking at things like how many, like I said before, like are we seeing % increase over time of people coming to our website? If we are, great. Where are they going? Are they just staying for 2 seconds and leaving? Or are they going to the 3 key resources that we thought were going to be the best? And we can also track where those resources go online. Did they share them with somebody? What did they do with them? So as long as they're doing stuff on the internet, we can get a pretty good handle about what people are responding to, how often, and whether or not that's growing or shrinking. And those are the kinds of indicators that we typically use in my office.
So you watch a trend.
Basically, yeah. We're not at the level. Someday, if I had $1 million, one thing I would do is set up the kinds of studies that you're describing to mirror, for example, the research we do on the front end, on the back end with the same respondents or with a similar group of respondents. Right now, I'm still tap dancing to get the research money to do stuff on the front end, but in a perfect world, we'd be able to do that on the back end as well, or periodically as well, annually or something like that. That would be awesome. I would love that. Yeah. Did you have a question in the back?
Is there a good way to discern between, okay, we have an audience that's being transformed versus an audience that already agrees with us, and now they're coming to our website and engaging with our campaign? Are these subscribers that you can kind of track their changes in attitudes, or is there another way to understand what those feedback means?
So in small ways, we can do that if they're leaving us, say, we have a pretty robust qualitative side to our research team. So if what they're doing is leaving us qualitative information, Facebook comments are a great example, then we can use that alongside things like analytics to make an argument one way or the other. Yes, it seems like we're seeing more people, number one, new people, number two, they're sharing attitudes that they didn't share before, or that we're seeing their attitudes change over time, or we're seeing the use of specific language change over time. Those are all things we can track. And on a good day, I can't think of an example off the top of my head where we've been able to do that yet. My position is only 2.5 years old, but I can certainly imagine that that would be an outcome we'd be able to show. That would be a really good day for me, by the way. If we got to there, I would take off early probably that day. That would be a really good day for me, for our whole team. Yeah. Yeah, Zahar.
I have a question that I think is just kind of a constant struggle. These things.
Yeah.
With the program, and I'm coming from the program kind of thing.
Yeah.
With the program people being like, yeah, but I mean, it's really nice to talk about the emotions, but that's not where it's at, right? And there's a lot of actual critique, and this is not just from obviously our program staff, but grassroots movements. We see on the ground, a lot of the critique is like, yeah, but we don't want you to talk about how, like, these emotional things, these are structural issues, you have to touch it. And there's constantly this tension between how do you reach people where they're at and bring them on, while at the same time people's lives and kind of from a movement level are pulling in another direction that also has its merit. And I mean, I don't think there's a good answer, but I'd love to hear like thoughts about how do you balance some of that.
I mean, I think there's a great answer, and you just said half of it, which is reaching people where they're at is only the start.
Yeah. This is not the be all and end all.
Yeah. We talk about values, but that's not a thing that's separate from truth and facts and action.
Right.
It's about starting there and moving them somewhere. So, for example, the Gaza Unlocked campaign came out of the fact that it was really hard to get people to support the work at all.
Yeah. We're getting trolled all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't get people to engage with the facts.
Yeah.
There is a base of people who cares about issues in Palestine and Israel, and even that base of people in the U.S. don't know about Gaza. So where do you start? But no, meeting people where they're at isn't about staying there, and I think that's the part that always gets dropped off. We say, you gotta meet people where they're at, you gotta meet people where they're at. If you're just meeting people where they're at, you're going backwards. You have to meet people where they're at and then move them.
Right.
And that's why we talk about values to frame a problem, a solution, and an action. The problem is a factual, real thing that exists in the world. The solution is something that actually needs to be done. The action is something that actually needs to be done. So yeah, I absolutely 100% agree with you.
Yeah, 100%.
I think another thing that you can talk to them about is that there's this analysis that there are these 4 phases of power, and that we often as organizers focus on organized people and organized resources or money and information, but we actually run into organized narrative, and organizing the narrative is a way to build power for your movement. So if you can share that kind of power building framework with them, that gets them beyond just the tactic into why you're doing the tactic, that might be a useful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth noting, as Joss pointed out earlier, it's worth stating again, there's a lot of money that goes into this kind of research. Like, I'm talking millions and millions of dollars that groups on the other side of pick an issue that AFSC works on, they're throwing money into this kind of research and into this kind of work because they know how effective it can be to move large numbers of people, especially given the fact that there's 1.7 billion people on Facebook, and most of those people spend a couple of hours every day. I mean, that's just like an unheard of level of connectivity in our world today. So it's worth noting that, like, it's wonderful that AFSC is investing in this capacity, and other progressive groups are as well. We're being outspent. I don't even know by how much, because those numbers would never be public, but we're being outspent like a bazillion to one. So it's.
And what are these other people doing?
Oh,
They're
strategic.
doing all this research that you wish you had the resources to.
Oh, I'm just talking about like private companies that do strategic messaging research and this kind of messaging work that Joss is describing as well. But for but not for peace and justice.
I mean, this kind of works
For-
both the religious right.
Right, exactly. This is where
Like,
family
that doesn't
values
exist
comes from.
by
Right.
accident. There was-
Exactly,
There
exactly.
was ways of framing stuff.
Yep.
There were books that were produced that
Yep.
were read in,
Yep.
you know, book groups of suburban white women who then ran for local office,
Yep.
who then et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like lots and lots and lots of money going into building things like
Yep.
Fox News.
Yep. Countering violent extremism is another great example. Millions and millions of dollars were poured into like finding that phrase and that kind of language, that softer, quote unquote, softer side of security that's going to work best. Like that was message tested for a long time, and it's part of the security state that we have here in the U.S.
Those women at Fox News a whole lot of good, didn't
Well,
You keep going.
sure, thanks.
Fox tabloid.
I just have two more examples that I want to share, and then we'll still have about 15 minutes for questions. Our work in North Korea is our third ongoing campaign that's a narrative change. That's a good, I think, example of narrative change work that we've both done a lot of work on. So here the research was about, or here our research showed that language and framing around engaging everyday North Koreans was sticking, even in this highly charged, I keep saying historically bad 2 years, but like historically bad couple of weeks especially. We were able to show through our own research and research that was done by others that something like 81% of Americans actually support engagement with even with North Korea, and a similar level support sanctions and report feeling afraid. So again, we have that fear is a very powerful motivator, and yet engagement was part of the conversation. And so through that research and also through a lot of trial and error by our partners who are working mostly in DC and in China and North Korea as well, we were able to show, and we've got data to back this up as well, that when we frame the problem in terms of a lack of engagement, we actually do pretty good. And we've been able to keep, us and our partners, AFSC and its partners, have been able to keep engagement language part of the conversation, both in the media and on the Hill, in ways that really could have gone the other direction given how tense things have been over the last 2 years or so. So the solutions that we, yeah.
What's the definition of engagement?
So it's a great question. It means different things to different audiences. People-to-people engagement's one example. Cultural exchange programs, educational exchange programs, scientific exchange programs, things like that. AFSC has a great report on, talks about 3 different engagement programs. 2 are with university students, and 1 was a group of scientists from the AAAS, the American Academy of something science. Advancement of Science, thank you so much, yeah. The AAAS scientists and North Korean universities and scientists, and talks about the impact of that, AFSC's role in it, and what those kinds of programs can do for individuals. So that's one example. It's also diplomatic engagement. We haven't been able to take the conversation as far as I'm sure our colleagues would like to go, simply because things have been so bad. But the fact that I had a phone call just earlier this week where we were reassuring each other, like the fact that engagement is still part of the conversation after the last 2 weeks, after the last 2 years, I think is a real campaign win for them, personally, because it certainly could have gone the other direction. People routinely and have historically talked about feeling very afraid of North Korea. People in the U.S., I mean. Large majorities rated as one of the top 3 threats to the U.S. And I'm sure those numbers are going to go up before they go down. So the fact that people also talk about, well, it's still important to engage human beings in North Korea, that's great. I think that's, and that's something that we've used a lot in our communications and that we've got data to show has had some success over the last 2 years. Also helps us frame the actions that we encourage people to take around North Korea. Sign a petition to support people-to-people engagement, sign petitions, build support, email your representative and so forth about making sure humanitarian interventions and humanitarian missions to North Korea can continue even though we're in these terrible times, things of that nature. And then the last example before I open it up for questions, we'll still have about a little over 10 minutes, is our campaign from 2014 to 2016, Governing Under the Influence. Here, the value that we used was civic engagement. It's important. It's something we want people it's something people feel strongly about. And we see it as under threat from corporations spending tons and tons of money, especially during presidential primaries. So one thing to know about this campaign was that our offices in New Hampshire and Iowa had been doing electoral work during presidential primaries for a really long time. And this was a new way of thinking about that work, of them organizing that work around the shared value of civic engagement. The problem that threatens civic engagement is the outsized role that corporations are playing in this post-Citizens United environment. The solution that they proposed was, hey, come on out. Like, we're New Hampshire, we're Iowa. Iowans and people from New Hampshire have a unique role to play in getting candidates, holding candidates accountable to citizens, to voters, to people in the U.S. And you can bird dog too. So this was a pretty intensive training exercise. They trained over 1,000 what we call bird dogs, and that's just someone who's trained to go up to a candidate at a town hall, at a public forum, put a hand and a microphone in their face and get them on record on the issues, the AFSC issues that matter. And so we had volunteers going out all over Iowa, all over New Hampshire, throughout the presidential primaries, even when there was like 20 candidates. People were going to town halls all the time. I can't remember the total number of actions that were taken, but we had some real campaign successes with this one. We were able to get Hillary Clinton on record as coming out against the immigrant detention bed quota, which is a fancy way of saying a number set by U.S. ICE policy to lock up a certain number of people every night, and a couple of other key issues that we work on. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to our bigger discussion. Thank you so much.
I want to go back to, I know you said the extreme right you cannot change.
Oh, I didn't say that.
That's not your focus.
That right now for that one campaign.
Because ultimately what's wrong with this, I don't know what happened to it. Say all the terrorists of 9/11 were Islamic faith. You can't change that fact. So it's just kind of
There's more of them than there is of us.
It's just a.
And it really just comes down to organizing strategy.
Yeah.
And to our role as AFSC, to what we can do as organizers, as activists, as people in politics, and what's a strategic use of our resources. Because it's not just about the ideas level, right? It's about concrete lived experience and having people stopping experiencing extreme repression, war, violence. How do we make that change? Yes, we want to change everyone's hearts and minds. We need to make the concrete change too. Our job is to move a base of people who care about these issues or who should care about these issues, to equip them with skills, resources, knowledge that they need to go out there and do their work. So yes, we do need to move everyone, but you have to start somewhere.
Thinking again of the public health or the health education approach to it and the stages of change, like with having people stop smoking, you find out first whether there's any hope of them making a change, and you have different messages according to how far along they are. How do you do that with a community campaign as opposed to working with individuals? And do you just have to have all the messages ready to give to them as they get there, or do you do them simultaneously? Or
I'm glad you brought up public health. That's actually my background prior to AFSC. I was doing health behavior change and health communications, and mostly in schools around healthy eating. But the principles and the research are actually really, really similar. It's just the scale and the goal are typically different, and a lot of the tactics are different. So in my past life, I was working one-on-one with school children or with their teachers or with their principals to both change how people thought and felt about healthy eating, but also to change the food environment in which they were living and eating and buying food and seeing food and so forth. And these were in mostly food deserts, first in Central America and then in North Philadelphia. And it was very much a one-on-one strategy. And I got to know the individuals well enough that I knew for kindergarten through first grade, this set of messages worked the best. And then for the older kids, this set of messages worked the best. And for the teachers, this was what was going to get them on board, and the parents and the principals and so forth. Here, we use research, and I found that out partly through research, through health communications literature, but also through a lot of personal experience. And then here, it's very similar. We use research. I can't go out and meet 1.7 billion Facebook users, right? But what we can do is we can interview people. We can use we can use statistically relevant sampling techniques, purposive sampling, and so forth, to get an approximation of what a specific group of people think and feel on an issue, what will move them on an issue, and so forth. That's a lot of my work is either me or my interns calling people on the phone, sending out online surveys, working, when we have a budget, working with research partners who have like big recruiting databases to get even better sample sizes and so forth. That's a lot of my day-to-day. And then we test that out with different segments of that audience or with different groups from that audience. So folks that we know are a little bit younger and a little bit more visually oriented. Maybe we try some of this messaging on Instagram. We always use it in our web content, or at least to the extent possible, we use it in our web content so that we can make sure we've got that unified voice coming out of AFSC when we're talking to older folks. Facebook is a great way to target, and so forth. So that doesn't get, and then our partners on the ground are doing similar things on the ground, much more in that one-to-one vein typically. For us in communications, again, it typically comes back to digital communications and national communications versus that on the ground. But I think it takes a lot of hands to make light work. And that if we can speak with one voice, and we can speak with a voice that's informed by what is actually happening on the ground, both from our partners and from the individuals that our organizers and our program staff know really, really, really well, to get back to that, like knowing the teachers, knowing the students, knowing the principals level, and marry that with the digital communications level, can be a really powerful force for change.
It's one of the reasons that having research is such an incredible thing, is there's lots of assumptions that we can make about the audience that we talk to, and when we have a research department, they could actually speak with that audience. We know, for example, down to specific email lists, what the people on those lists care about. And that's really valuable, not because we want to just give them that, but because when we know that, what we're hearing from the advocates we work with, for example, from the people we work with on immigration who are saying these narratives about, well, it's the good families, not the rapists and the criminals, are making their lives so much harder. How do we reach an audience that we know is actually in that narrative right now, and get them around that? And yeah, having that knowledge sort of lets us know who we're talking to begin with, so that we can do the rest of these pieces.
Yeah, Mark.
Could you speak more to what you said was the people have negative feelings, and you supply them with facts that can challenge that. They double down, because that's been my experience. That's my approach, and I've been in Tennessee for a long time, and it's right wing, and it's exactly across the board. People are even somewhat progressive. They just turn off. And Could you speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's a finding that's coming out of psychology and political science across a range of issues. It's unfortunate because it makes our jobs harder, but I think I wonder if you could share your experience on abortion messaging in West Texas. At least I know that the campaign didn't have success, but the research did show how to reach.
I mean, there's been success later on. There was internal research over a decade ago now within the reproductive rights movement that was telling us that the pro-choice frame wasn't working for a young audience and wasn't working for a non-white audience in a lot of places. And one of the places that we saw that was West Texas, where there was some particular research because it's one of the places hardest hit. There isn't access. There are providers. And also because the national movement, the national abortion rights movement, for decades now has really had this idea that their base was white women, and had really had stereotyping ideas around women of color, around women of faith. So looking at a community, a West Texas community that was predominantly Latina and Catholic, the movement just assumed this is the opposition. The fact is, what was learned through research was that the vast, overwhelming majority of young Latina Catholic women in this area was supportive of abortion access, but they didn't identify as pro-choice because the choice frame didn't make sense to them, it didn't speak to them, it wasn't how they thought about this issue. This issue was about family, and it was about religion, it was about these things that the white reproductive rights movement considered the issues we needed to get around and not address and not work on. And for the longest time this was ignored by the movement. There was, in the past couple of years, a huge push from activists in states, including in Texas, because of a huge loss. You might have seen Wendy Davis's filibuster, like huge loss, but it was such this big push and groundswell from young activists who were saying enough, we're being failed by the movement, that now they're all there. And resources are finally going into places like Texas that have been ignored forever because there was just an assumption that no support could be built. There are actually ways to talk to the people that we assume are on the other side. There are actually ways of finding out that they're not on the other side and we're just speaking a language that isn't their language.
So can you give us an example of how, what the phrases switched to from pro-choice to?
Yeah, so it went from abortion is a choice to I'm doing what's best for my family. I'm making a decision based in my faith, in my family, I'm caring for my family. The majority of women who have abortions have or will have children. That wasn't part of the story for a long time. I'm doing this for my children is a very different story that we're finally starting to hear and that's finally landing with people who were already supportive of that, but we assumed couldn't be part of the base.
Right. So another example, if you can, there's a movie called When Love Wins. So in Minnesota, there was an amendment against same-sex marriage. It was a pro-marriage amendment for just between men and women. And we used a narrative strategy there. And so instead of saying, we're right, you're wrong, because as soon as you say you're wrong, then people double down on their position. It was like, family is important, love is important, families are important for children. The commitment when people get married to each other supports communities. There were tens of thousands of conversations. I mean, it was an organized narrative campaign, switching the narrative, tens of thousands of conversations with people in churches all over the state. And so that amendment was defeated, and the next year same-sex marriage passed in the legislature. That is how powerful that strategy is. But you have to have it organized. So and it's a different level. You guys are talking about just getting people to you.
Right.
That was actually a way that it was organized. That was for a bigger power shift.
Yeah, absolutely.
People were literally coming out to people on their doorsteps. It really is ultimately that face-to-face conversation. The tools to serve it.
That's a wonderful example to end on, and I should just add, just to lift up what you just said, they use this framework too. like they had a different, organized LGBTQ rights organizations had one discourse and they weren't winning on it, and when they changed to the Love Wins framework, that is really part of what helped the day-to-day organizing, the face-to-face conversation shift in the way that ultimately showed amazing gains.
One last comment, if we have time.
Sure, yeah.
Just a request that sometime next year, maybe there'd be a workshop following up on this, but how individuals can use Facebook.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Because, your comment that people spend, 2 hours a day on it.
I can't remember the average, but it's like.
But no, but it's also, it is one of the places in my experience where I encounter people with radically different views than mine. And something other than, here's the facts, you're wrong, would be a wonderful way to amplify the whole AFSC message.
That's a great idea, we'll definitely take that back.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, I can, like, little spoiler warning for things coming up in Islamophobia trainings, because we were just at a planning meeting, and one of the requests that they had to us on the media and the social media teams was specific action steps to give people to post on social media. Because of exactly that.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the organizing things that they want to use.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We have a little handout. You can also find this on our website. The URL is at the top. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Yeah, and we have handouts.